fitting song for this morning. We're going to be talking about idolatry. In fact, I titled my sermon this morning, Idolatry, the Sin of Worship. We're talking a lot about surrender and worship and the ideas behind those things. And so we are going to be in Matthew 4. You don't have to turn there just yet. We've got some ground to cover before we get to Matthew 4. I was in Germany at the beginning of the week with a group of students and adults that all went on a mission trip over to Hamburg, Germany. Brian joked that as we were coming back, we got up super early. We had to be at the airport, I think, at 4 in the morning, and so we got up super early and kind of headed to the airport. And we think we had 4 meals coming home, but we're not sure if any of them were breakfast and dinner. It was like 4 lunches trying to get home, and so it was a little bit of a wild trip. Some unexpected things happened. We had 5 different people connected to that team get sick. But this morning we were talking with some of our staff, and we were talking about some of the unexpected things that had happened on other trips, and it seems like God does some amazing things in those unexpected and unplanned for events. Sometimes that's God working to set the stage for something else. And so there's some cool stories connected to that. You need to talk to the rec team. You need to talk to our Germany team about some of the unexpected things that God did on their trips. So we left about 2 weeks ago to go to Germany. We went with a group called IGO. They focus on student ministry missions, and so they send college students and youth all around the world for as short as a week and for as long as a year. And so they do all sorts of different trips, and they do some training called igoja. And it's quite the experience. It's a lot of fun, but pushes the kids to get out of their comfort zone. We get to Germany. We're working with some International Mission Board partners. They were a great team. 2 of them were among the ones that got sick, kind of creating some of the unexpected stuff that we had to deal with. And on our first day there, we did an idol walk, and we're going to talk more about that in just a second. So let me just kind of keep going. On our second day, we spent the day kind of praying through and canvassing neighborhoods. We did that for several days, where we just spent time in parks and neighborhoods, just having conversations with people. Sharing the gospel. For many of them, the ones that heard the gospel, they heard it for the first time. And for others, it was the first kind conversation they had ever had with someone claiming to be Christian. Hamburg is 1% Christian, and so part of our task, part of our job in Hamburg was just to create a positive impression of Bible-believing Christians. That was part of why we were there. Let me circle back, though, to the way we kicked off the trip, the idol walk. So our IMB team leader, his name was Scott, he takes us out and he begins to show us a tour of the city. We split into 2 groups just so that we could have better conversation. We were a big team for them, and so we split into 2 groups, and they're giving us a tour of key features of the city with a focus on getting us to understand what is important to the people of Hamburg, important things that they may have turned into idols, things that they worship instead of God. And so he wants us to see these key features of the city so that we can understand how best to share the gospel with them. So I want to show you a couple of the things that they showed us. The first one that our guide took my group to was the idol of education. They took us to a school. I had to find a picture from somebody else. They took us to a school because education is really, really important in Hamburg, Germany. In fact, it's so important, they actually have 2 different school systems for elementary age kids. They actually split them, I think in 4th grade, I may be misremembering the grade, into an accelerated program and a slower program. And there's a lot of pressure on the Germans to get their kids into the gymnasium, the accelerated programs. College is super important. Our guide was actually telling us without a high school diploma, you basically can't work in Germany. There is no employment. You're going to end up basically homeless. College is also really, really important, and it's all free in Germany, all the way up through a PhD. It's all free. If you go to a public school, everything is free. And so he said it's not unusual for you to go into a coffee shop and your barista to have a PhD because they idolize education. So that was one of the ones we saw. We also saw the idol of commerce. The idol of commerce. Hamburg is a major port city, often called Germany's gateway to the world. The port itself is over 800 years old. This has been a place of commerce for almost 600 years, longer than the United States has existed. They have had goods flowing in and out of this city for 600 years, longer than the United States has existed. Money and commerce are important to the city. So they took us to the rail yard, which you should have seen a picture of. They took us to the port to see all of the ships that were lined up with millions and millions of tons of goods stacked up ready to go into Germany. They also talked about the idol of church or tradition, specifically the idol of church tradition. Like much of Europe, Hamburg has a church history dating back well over 1,000 years. One of the missionaries told us a story about her language teacher who goes to church every Sunday and believes nothing in the Bible. He goes to church because he believes that it is a tether for the German people to history. He wants his son to have that tether to the history of the German people. And so he takes his family every Sunday to sit in the pews of a church believing nothing in the Bible. They have begun to idolize tradition and church and history. By maintaining your membership, you actually pay taxes to the national church, to the federal church. And by maintaining your membership, you can do your wedding for free in these beautiful 100-year-old cathedrals. So they've begun to worship the buildings and their tradition rather than the God for whom they were built. The last one that our guide kind of took us to was the idol of government. They took us to kind of the main courthouse where we got to see where like the government of Hamburg is kind of centralized and run. You'll see that this is kind of the outside. You'll see a picture inside in just a second. The people of Germany are very dependent. They're very hopeful. Their hope is centered in their government. Their hope for the future, their hope for a better future is through the government. That is their hope. They have begun to worship, to depend on for their security and comfort and peace and hope, their government. As we were walking through the streets of Hamburg, though, I began to think about idolatry. What is idolatry? What would it look like for us to do an idol walk in Midland? Like if we brought in a foreign mission team to help us spend time in parks and share the gospel with people, if we brought people into this city to help us connect with new faces and share the gospel, where would I take them to show them what the idols might be among the lost people that they would be dealing with? And so I want us to take a brief virtual idol walk through the city of Midland. I think one that we would share, in fact, I think there are several that we would share with Germany, but I think one of the ones that we would share with Germany is the idol of commerce. I think there are a lot of people in Midland who have begun to worship business and making money. Obviously, ours looks different here. It's not a port, that's for sure. There is no pond between here and Odessa, right? I mean, it's just dirt and oil. But I think the idol of commerce is one that our people might naturally struggle with. It's easy to work hours and hours and hours and hours and build great businesses that make a lot of money out here. Not easy, but certainly possible, right? You can make a lot of money out here. You can build great businesses that employ a lot of people. So I think the idol of commerce is one that we might need to talk to that missions team about. I think that the idol of education and sports is another potential one that we might need to talk to a missions team about. Our communities and our people, they value education, and again, that is not a bad thing until we begin to worship it. I think we might give it a unique Midland, Texas, America flair. We might not have the grand cathedrals of Europe with hundreds or thousands of years of history in them, but man, do we have high school facilities, right? I mean, we have stadiums and gyms and pools and fields and auditoriums and theaters that would put most colleges around the world to shame. And again, I'm not necessarily criticizing that. My concern isn't the buildings themselves. It is when we turn those things into idols, into things that we worship. And I think if we're counseling with a missions team ministering here in the city or a new church planner, I think we would need to talk about the idol of education and sports here in Midland. Again, one we might share with Germany is the idol of government. There are a lot of people in our country right now who their hope for the future on both sides their hope for the future is in the government. My hope for the future is not. My hope for the future does not rest in my government. My hope for my future rests in my Lord. Does not mean that I won't vote, does not mean that I don't have an opinion, but my hope for the future is not in the government. But I think there are a lot of lost people in our city who they have begun to idolize, to worship government because it is their hope for their children's future. I think one that might be a unique twist for Midland, or at least the South, is the idol of family. I wasn't entirely sure about including this one, but I chose to after all because I think there are times where in our kind of Southern conservative culture, family can become an idol. I think this is one that my mom's family in particular might struggle with because our attitude has always been wired in us family first. If there is a family emergency, you drop everything. It does not matter. And that's a good thing for the most part, but it can twist to the worship of family. You have to be really careful with that. And I think sometimes family in our culture, the good of our family, the enjoyment of our family ends up overriding the worship of God. And so I think that we might need to talk to a missions team about the idol of family. And the last one, I didn't want to put a picture up because I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't want to throw up a picture. I do think in our culture that the idol of church is something that people struggle with. I think that there are people who struggle with this idea of tradition and history in the church, and that church is not necessarily always about God. I think we see that actually because the most common time for somebody that leaves the church to return to the church is when they have kids. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's for the right reasons. They want their kids to grow in the love of God. And so every now and then, that is for the right reasons. But I think a lot of times the reason that happens then is because they are hoping to tether their kids to the history and traditions that they grew up with. They are hoping to tether their family to the experiences that developed and made them who they are. None of these things are necessarily bad things until we begin to worship them in place of God the Father. I think if we were guiding around a missions team, I think that these are things that we would need to talk with them about. And these can be a little sensitive. Idols always are. Carl de Vries wrote of idols, most idolatry of the Israelites was borrowed from their neighbors. During the more than 400 years that the descendants of Jacob spent in Egypt, they were exposed to polytheistic idolatry, which influenced their religious mindset. At Sinai, while Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments from the Lord, the people were demanding that Aaron make gods for them. See Exodus 32. He fashioned a golden calf following an Egyptian form for the whole bovine family, the whole cow family, was worshipped in Egypt. The Apis bull, the Hathor cow, and the Nevis calf were all idols that they had been exposed to and seen in Egypt. And so when they are fearful, when they are afraid, and they don't think that God is speaking clearly, they turn to the idol of a calf. They have him make a golden cow, right? We find that the same is true today. People struggle with the idols that they find around them. They struggle with worshiping the things that they see. And not all of these are necessarily religious, like physical idols, but are very often good things in this world that we come to desire more than we desire God. Just look at Adam and Eve. What is the thing that they desire? It's the thing that they see with their eyes, right? It's the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They see it, they are tempted by it, they begin to lust for it and idolize it. They are tempted by what they see. Or take the Pharisees. The things that they idolized were not necessarily or exclusively evil. They idolized the traditions and power structures of the world they grew up knowing. But these were things that God had given them mostly in his law. I mean, God gave them these things to the people. He gave them to the nation of Israel. They were meant as good things, but they began to worship them rather than worship God through them. Full confession, had I lived 2,000 years ago, knowing myself as I do, I would have struggled in similar ways, I think, to the Pharisees. My heart would have been pulled in similar ways to the Pharisees. I like rules, and I like it when people follow them, except for the speed limit. I'm a good Midlander. I like rules, and I like structure, and I like tradition. I would have been tempted in that way. God understood that we would all struggle with idolatry, and so before we go to our main text, I want to talk about what idolatry is for just a second. God understood that we would wrestle and that we would struggle with this. He gave us the first 4 commandments, tying them directly to the worship of God for that reason. If you go to Exodus, you don't have to turn there, I'll just read it. Exodus 20, 2 through 6. It says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven or above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water or under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for the Lord your God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the children, to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to the thousands who love me and keep my commandments. The golden calf and the 10 commandments are basically taking place simultaneously. God understood that we would struggle with worshiping him. He understood that our heart would turn to the things around us, and he gives us the 10 commandments. If you look at Judges 2, 1 through 3, it says, Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. The people of Israel are supposed to drive out the inhabitants of the land, fully destroy where they worship, destroy what they worship, and they failed to do so. And God tells them, because of this, you are going to struggle. It is going to be hard for you to resist the idolatry of the people around you. One last comment on idolatry. G.K. Beale wrote in his book, We Become What We Worship. He wrote this, what people revere, they resemble, either for ruin or restoration. People begin to resemble their idols. They shape their life and bend their emotional energy, their physical energy, all of their strength. They bend it around what they worship. That is either God or it is something else. We begin to resemble the things that we worship, either for our ruin or for our restoration. Now that we've seen what an idol might be and we've talked about what an idol is, I want us to turn to Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Because I think we will find some natural things, some natural groupings of idols that are revealed in the temptation of Jesus. I think that these broad categories of idols can help us understand and guard against idols in our own lives, in our own cultures, and in our own cities. Let's read Matthew 4, 1 through 3. And we're actually going to stop partway through verse 3. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, we're gonna pause right there. So if you're taking notes, I want you to notice that idols are going to be revealed. Idols are revealed in the temptation of Jesus. I am defining idolatry as the sin of worship. Idolatry is worshiping anything other than God himself. It is the inversion of the created order. It is taking something that God has created and putting it in God's place. Whether it's a tie or whether it's a head, it is idolatry if that created thing is in God's place. But the ideas of sin and temptation are so closely intertwined with the idea of idolatry that we need to talk for just a second about what those are as well. I'm defining sin as anything that we do that goes against the nature or character of God. Essentially, anything that we do that God would not do, that goes against who he is or his character. And I'm going to define temptation as the pull of our heart and our mind towards sin. Temptation is not sin in and of itself. Jesus was tempted. Literally talking about that today. Matthew 4. Temptation is not sin, but it is a closely tied concept, and they are intertwined together. So I want us to have good, solid definitions of those before we dive in. So the first idol that I want us to talk about is the idolatry of possessions, the worship of possessions or stuff, if you want to use a shorter word. The idolatry of possessions. Let's read Matthew 4, 3 through 4. And the tempter came to him and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Satan is tempting Jesus in this particular case with food. Now, the stuff for us can be all sorts of things. There are all sorts of things that he puts in front of us. It can be anything from clothes to food to homes to TVs to cars. You get the idea. We become worshipers of possessions anytime we begin to wrap our lives around the acquisition or consumption of stuff rather than our holy, giving God. Anytime we contort our lives, our finances, our mental, physical, and emotional energy around getting stuff, we cross into the idolatry of possessions. For some people who grew up with nothing, this looks different than for other people. The Great Depression generation, my grandmother kind of grew up out of right behind that generation. They're often very careful with money and possessions, and being frugal is great when it's wrapped around serving and worshiping God. But being miserly and cheap has many of the same actions tied to them, but for a different purpose. It's wrapped around self-care. It's wrapped around family or fear, not a holy, giving, perfect God. For these people, the only thing that separates worship from idolatry is the motivation, the object of our worship. If the object of our worship is God, then saving can be a worshipful practice in our lives. If the object of our worship is money, then saving is us getting on our knees before the idol of money. We are constantly bombarded with images of possessions in our culture. You can't get on social media or TV without being advertised some object that you want. And I am, as much as anybody else, I like shiny new things. Don't we all? I mean, I like a shiny new car or a shiny new iPhone. That one some of you may not can relate to as much, but you know, I like new and shiny. I enjoy things. And we're just constantly bombarded with images of possessions in our culture. There are whole YouTube channels and social media streams that are devoted to showing us the latest and greatest tech or car. My dad and I can go to the car dealership and enjoy looking around at all the nice new trucks and cars with no intention of buying. It's just fun. Some of you are thinking, that is crazy. But then some of you can go to the shopping mall and spend hours, and I want to die. Like, I want to go in and out and just be done. Like, it stresses me out to be in the mall for more than 10 minutes. But we like things. People like things. We always have. For some of you, maybe it's browsing the mall or surfing the internet, looking at clothes. Maybe it's guns or golf clubs. Maybe it's Legos or Barbies. Maybe it's cars or homes. Maybe it's clothes or jewelry. Whatever it is, we cannot let things become the object of our affection and the direction of our worship, yet it happens so easily. It is so easy for things to become the object of our worship. Our culture, our city, we struggle with idolatry of possessions. We watch all the time as our neighbors buy and consume. Make sure that our heart is also not drawn to the worship of possessions. Jesus responds to this temptation to worship things with this simple phrase. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. When we are tempted by the possessions, by the things of this world, be it money or objects, whatever it is, our heart should respond, "It is written, I should not live by food or clothing or cars or homes, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Pretend for a minute to be an academic observer of your life who has full access to observing the way that you live. Would your actions demonstrate a love for God, a hunger for His word, a love for things, and a hunger for the latest and greatest? Next, I want to talk about the idolatry of prestige. We're going to read Matthew 4, 5 through 7. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." You need to understand that what Jesus is being tempted with here is fairly similar to the younger son in the parable of the prodigal son. Satan is challenging Jesus. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down and prove it. Make God reveal who you are, your rights. You are the Son of God. You have rights to everything. Make God reveal who you are to everyone. He's telling Jesus, not in God's time, but in your time, reveal who you are, the Son of God. Make the people around you bow and worship you. He's tempting him with prestige, and it is a huge temptation in our culture. For younger generations, a lot of times that's tied to social media. If I actually saw a little poll given to 18 to 25-year-olds, if you had the option of getting instantly 1 million followers on social media or $1 million, which one would you choose? And 1 million followers won 80% to 20%. They would rather have 1 million followers on social media than $1 million. Now, if you know anything about social media, 1 million followers can turn into $1 million fairly easily if you're good at it. But they would rather have the followers than the cash in hand. But the other generation struggles with this in different ways. Man, maybe it's belonging to the right clubs, the country club or the Lions club or the petroleum club. Maybe you're tempted to run for offices that God has not called you to. Maybe you're tempted to positions that God has not called you to. Guys, there are people that have preached in the pulpit worshiping the idol of prestige. We know that because in Philippians, Paul kind of calls some of them out. In Philippians 1, it is true that some preach out of envy and rivalry. The idol of prestige is not specific to a social class, a career, a gender, or a generation. It is an idol we can easily find ourselves worshiping on any given day. The last idol that I want to talk about is the idolatry of power, and we're going to read our last few verses 8 through 11. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you if you fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, the angels came and were ministering to him. Satan promises Jesus lordship over the entire world if he will fall down and worship Satan. The temptation for power is one that echoes through all of our fallen world. A lot of the brokenness in this world is because of people worshiping the idol of power and seeking power where God has not intended for them to have it. If any of you have ever been insulted or abused or slighted and then imagined a scenario in which you have the power to inflict punishment on that person equal to or worse than what fit the crime, and I certainly have, that's us wrestling with the idol of power. I've imagined being able to put that guy that cut me off in his place, right? Maybe he gets a flat, because I can snap my fingers and he gets a flat. We struggle with the idolatry of power. Broken churches, cities, schools, homes, and nations all suffer because our heart longs for power that God has not given. People longing for it, shaping their lives around it, who God has not called to it, can be very destructive, and that can be us very easily. People around the world and in our city struggle with the idol of power. You may have noticed how intertwined these categories can be. One man seeking riches may also gain prestige and power. But the question is, what are you worshiping? And that is our question for this morning. And as we go into a time of invitation, I want you to understand something, that resisting idolatry requires recognizing the lordship of God. Look at Matthew 4, verse 10. Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." I want to show you two final pictures from our time in Germany. On one day, we had the chance to work with this church plant, and we were actually putting up a tent. This is where this church is planning to worship someday. This church planter is hoping to plant a church in this tent in a city covered with cathedrals that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. They are planning to worship in a tent because they are a Bible-believing church and they do not need a cathedral. It doesn't mean you can't worship God full-heartedly in a cathedral, but they don't worship the cathedral. They worship the God. And they can worship the God in the tent just as easily as in the cathedral. On our last day, one of the unexpected things happens was that we met a church that was largely Romani Bulgarian. We actually got to participate in a baptism service for them. Me and one of the missionaries and some of our students, we got to participate in this and the Lord's Supper with this church. They have no building. They have no power in this country. They're largely refugees. They have no prestige in this country. In fact, many in this country wish that they were somewhere else. But they worship God. And they do it joyfully and gladly, whether it's in a park or somewhere else. What are you worshiping? In this time of invitation, I want to challenge you to consider what it is that you are worshiping this morning. Maybe you have never given your life to Jesus. Your entire life has been worshiping other things. And so the decision that you need to make this morning is that you need to surrender and give up all of those idols, whatever they are, and you need to give your life to Jesus. This is an opportunity for you to come have a conversation about that. I'll be down here for just a second. You can come and have a conversation right here in this place. You can catch me or one of our staff in the Welcome Center. You can call the church this week, whatever you need to do. I want you, if you have never cast out your idols and given your life to Jesus, to have a conversation about that this morning. Maybe you've given your life to Jesus, but you've never made that public profession that you saw in that last picture. Maybe you've never proclaimed publicly that you believe in Jesus, and you need to get baptized this morning to help finish casting out, pushing out those idols. You need to say, "Jesus, you are Lord of my life, and I'm going to obey you by getting baptized." I would love to have a conversation with you about that this morning. And maybe what you need to do this morning is just spend some time in prayer. Maybe you are struggling with the idolatry of stuff, of possessions. Maybe you're struggling with the idolatry of power or prestige. Maybe what your heart longs for most this morning is something other than Jesus. I would challenge you, if you need to get on your knees where you are, if you need to come down to the altar and get on your knees here, if you need to open your Bible, do what you need to do. But answer like Jesus answered, "Begone, I will worship the Lord and the Lord only this morning." I'm going to pray, and if you have any business that you need to do with the Lord, if you need to have any conversation, feel free to come down and talk to me. God, I want to thank you so much just for the incredible opportunity that we have this morning to open your word, for how clearly you speak to us on how to stand against the temptation to the idols of this world. God, where I have worshiped things other than you, I beg your forgiveness. Where my heart is turned towards the things of this world or the prestige of others or power in this place, God, I just ask that you help me to surrender that to you each and every day. Each morning as I get up, help me to surrender my idols to you. And I pray the same thing over everyone in this place. God, forgive us where we have failed as a church, as a community. God, forgive us where we have worshiped things other than you. God, turn our hearts to you this morning. I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. We're not going to take long, but if you need to do something this morning, you do your business with Jesus.